Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. What we're about to look into together has been studied for over 100 years without being fully known. Let me know where you're watching from. It is the year 1903, and the North Carolina mountains hide secrets as deep as their foggy valleys. This video is a work of fantasy that was influenced by folklore. Characters and events have been changed in creative ways. If they look like real people, it's just a coincidence. The story was made just for fun. There were a lot of different things going on in Asheville. On the one hand, fancy hotels received people from the north who came to enjoy the fresh air and beautiful scenery. On the other hand, people lived in small, isolated groups on the slopes of the Appalachians, carrying on customs that began with the first settlers. Even though the train had been there for a while, many places still looked like they were stuck in the 1800s. In the winter, dirt roads turned into mud holes, and thick fog could make it dangerous to drive. Someone to get lost only a few meters from home. The sisters, Cordelia and Marguerite Ashford, became well known in Buncombe County because of this place. Their home was in the middle of nowhere, 12 kilometers north of the city, surrounded by thick woods. The only sound you could hear was the wind whistling through the pine trees. The Ashford home was at the end of a narrow path and was surrounded by oak trees that looked like tall, silent guards. The twins were 32 years old when the first one died. There were stories going around. People knew them for their unique beauty, with hair as dark as night and eyes that some said looked right through you. People already thought they were dating because they were single at that age, which made people wonder if they were married. They were not only single, though. They were also very private, only letting people visit very rarely and always keeping talks short and almost cold. The people were most interested in where the sisters' wealth came from. The land belonged to their parents, who died in the winter of 1898 in an unknown cause. No one was sure what killed them. Dr. Harrison Whitfield, a doctor in the area, signed the death papers saying that the person had a fever but never gave any other information. After being buried quickly and quietly, the twins took over everything and lived even more alone. Over the next few months, city traders noticed something strange. It seemed like Cordelia and Marguerite were buying strange things. Many pounds of quicklime, digging tools, locks and chains that are heavy. When they were asked about the land or farm needs, they gave vague answers. There was no farm, though. They didn't take care of animals. A small vegetable patch was the only thing they planted. Someone left them money, but no one was sure where it came from. They lived off of it. A seller named Thomas Brennan went missing in April 1903. He used to go through Asheville selling clothes, drugs, and household items, and he would stop at the more remote homes. His route took him to the place where the Ashford girls live. Thomas was Irish and didn't have any family in the area. He was the kind of person who could leave without being noticed right away, but he had a boss in Knoxville, Tennessee, who thought it was odd that his salesman didn't show up on time. It was 5 weeks before someone started looking for Thomas with more determination. Eugene Dalton, who was the sheriff of Buncombe County, started looking into things in a quiet way. Traders, innkeepers, and families who lived along the paths, the salesmen, went on trips. That's how the names of the Ashford sisters first showed up in a strange situation. A woman who lived about 3 kilometers away from the boys' home said something scary. After carrying his heavy bags of goods, Thomas Brennan was going in that way the last time she saw him. It was late in the afternoon, and she told him not to go any further. As night fell before he got to a safe place, but Thomas wouldn't give up. He said he had to go somewhere, and that would be his last stop, before going back to Knoxville. He was not seen again. Sheriff Dalton chose to go see the Ashford sisters. He brought a young deputy who was too excited to be safe. It was early June, and the mountains were already feeling the heat. When they got to the property, they were met with a cold politeness. They had to wait outside while the twins got lemonade. They didn't ask them to come in. Thomas Brennan was directly asked about by Dalton. The sisters said to each other. Cordelia answered with an almost imperceptible glance, yes, he had been there. He had sold some things, rested a little, and then continued on his way before nightfall. They didn't know where he went afterward. Marguerite agreed with her sister completely, as if they had practiced the answer. Since the officer didn't want to wait any longer, he asked to browse the property. The twins got stiff. Cordelia said that they were trespassing and that there was no reason to think the worse of them. The sheriff read more. Experienced, felt the strain, and chose to back down. He didn't have a search order or proof of a crime. All he had was information about a man who had gone missing and whose last known location was unknown. E. Dalton wasn't stupid, though. He knew how to spot fear that was hiding as anger. The way those women looked at him made him think of the scary stories his grandmother used to tell him about mountain witches and dark pacts. He didn't believe in those things, of course. He followed the rules. Even though he was sensible and doubtful, he got a chill as he left that space. That night, when he got back to town, the sheriff started going through old records. He wanted to know more about the Ashford family, like how they got that land and what the boy's father did for a living. At that point, he found the first loose end of a much bigger plan. In 1892, Mr. Ashford, whose real name was Jonathan Ashford, was charged with theft. The case never went to court, though. Witnesses either vanished or changed what they said. The case went away quietly in the court records. Eugene Dalton learned more about that family's history, but he still had a lot of questions. Buncombe County records showed a past that was broken up and full of gaps that made sense. In 1875, Jonathan Ashford moved to Asheville from somewhere in Kentucky. Even though the papers never said for sure where it was, he paid cash for the remote land, which was unusual at the time. Most people came to America with little and built slowly. Jonathan came with a lot of money. He quickly married a woman from the area named Elizabeth Garner. She was the daughter of a small businessman who died soon after the wedding. Some said it happened by chance while they were hunting. Some people said that old Garner just drank himself to death. The twins were born in 1871. Cordelia came first, then Marguerite 7 minutes later. Elizabeth never fully got better after giving birth. She turned pale and quiet, and people rarely saw her in the city. Dalton talked to some older people. Who could remember that? A 70-year-old woman who had worked as a tailor for several families in the area told an interesting tale. No matter how hot it was in the Appalachians in the summer, Elizabeth Ashford always had dresses made with long sleeves and high collars. During one measure, the seamstress saw marks on Elizabeth's wrist. They weren't from falls or normal accidents around the house. Even though they looked like old scars, the tailor never asked what they meant. At that time, the family's business was their own. If you get in the way, you might lose business, or even worse. Jonathan Ashford was known for being a man who lost his rage easily. No one wanted to have trouble with him. As kids, the twins were almost invisible. They didn't go to the city school because their mother taught them at home when she was strong enough, or by teachers that Jonathan hired and fired all the time, which was scary. The few people who worked for the family said that the house had an oppressive mood. Things that were eaten, too long of silence. The girls were always quiet and obeyed, never talking. They were just watching. Elizabeth was the first to die in 1898. It happened in February, during a blizzard that cut off several homes for days. Jonathan came into town with the news when the snow finally melted and the roads were clear again. His wife had a fever and died. She was already buried in the property's small graveyard. Even though Dr. Whitfield had only briefly checked her out, he signed the death certificate without asking any questions. After 3 weeks, Jonathan was also gone. Same supposed cause, same hurry to bury. Everything was passed down to the twins, who are now 27 years old. And that's when the real change started. They took full charge with a firmness that surprised everyone. They had always been quiet and submissive. They fired the few workers who were still there. They didn't let anyone into the house. When they started buying those strange things, people in the city started to look at them funny. Eugene Dalton talked to shopkeepers for days. A worker thought back, selling the sisters heavy chains that are used to tie down big animals, even though they didn't have any animals of their own. One of the lumberjacks remembered bringing enough thick planks and nails to build something big. Cordelia only said that they were making fixes when asked what it was for. "What are the repairs?" She didn't say anything. The sheriff also found something scary in the records of the local church. The reverend kept a very well-kept book of baptisms, weddings, and deaths. Jonathan and Lizzie, Ashford were written down there as well as the twins' baptism, but there was a strange note in the margin written by the minister who had died before. It said, "May God protect these children from whatever lives in that house." That was all it said. Dalton showed the note to Samuel Pritchard, who was the reverend at the time and knew a lot of the people in the area. When Pritchard read it, he turned pale. He said the old reverend was a serious man who didn't like to joke around. Not at all myths. If he had written that, he had a reason, but nothing would ever be known about that cause. In the meantime, things went on as usual in Asheville. Extra tourists came to the UK in the summer of 1903. There were always people in the big hotel. People came to the mountains in search of fresh air and the belief that they could heal them. But as the evenings went on, people started talking about a new subject in the bars. The Ashford sisters, the seller who went missing. There were a lot of rumors, so Peter Donnelly, a reporter for a small city newspaper, chose to look into it himself. He was young, ambitious, and from Charlotte. He was looking for stories that would help him get his business off the ground. The absence of Thomas Brennan looked like the kind of case that would make for interesting writing. Peter began to talk to people in private while writing down everything in his black notebook. That's how he found out about other disappearances, some of which were not related to the Ashford sisters but were still happening. In the same area for many years. In 1899, a traveling roofer was last seen but never seen again. Around 1900, a woman who sold healing herbs stopped showing up at the markets. In 1901, a preacher who went around the mountains never finished his tour. These situations were all alike in one way. They didn't have strong roots or families that would make a big deal about their absences. Peter Donnelly put together what he had learned and went to find Sheriff Dalton. The two guys talked about their findings for an entire afternoon. The picture that came together was scary, but it was still only based on evidence. There is no reason for stronger judicial action. They needed solid proof, not just strange accidents. Then an unexpected witness showed up. A farm boy, 17, went to the sheriff and told him a scary story. He used to hunt in the woods close to the Ashford home. A few months ago, on a full moon night, he knew every path, stream, and clearing. He got back late and heard noises coming from the twins' house. They were strange. Sounds from the house. It looked like someone was digging metal into stone. A lot of work. While hiding in the woods, the boy slowly made his way closer. Lanterns lit up the garden, where he saw the two sisters. They were digging a big hole in complete silence, and their movements seemed to happen at the same time. He looked at them for long enough to know that they had done this before. There were signs that the soil had been moved around on other parts of the land. Being scared, the boy pulled away and went home. He was scared, so he didn't tell anyone. He was scared of his sisters being called a fake, and what they might find out if they looked into it. But when the salesman went missing and reports spread around the city, he changed his mind. His quiet could have been a way for him to hide something bad. It was now clear to Sheriff Dalton that the young man's story was too specific and detailed to ignore. He needed a warrant to search. He needed to go into that house and find out what the Ashford girls were hiding under that messed-up ground. This wouldn't be easy to do with a judge, though. The twins were well-off women who were considered to be fine in society. They had never been in trouble with the law, and charges based on rumors and vague evidence may not be enough. Something strange happened while Dalton was getting his case ready. A letter from someone unknown showed up at Peter Donnelly's job at the newspaper office. The writing was shaky, like it was done quickly or by hands that were shaking. It just said, "They. Look in the basement." The anonymous letter sparked a lot of speculation. Peter Donnelly took the letter right away to Sheriff Dalton, who carefully looked at the paper. It was a standard type of stationery that could be bought at any general store in the area. The ink also didn't show anything unusual, and the shaky handwriting suggested that someone was in a hurry or scared and didn't want to reveal who they were. Eugene Dalton couldn't sleep that night, thinking about what had happened. There weren't many options. It would be hard to get a search warrant based on an anonymous letter because judges were wary of trespassing on the property of good citizens. But the phrase "search the basement" was too specific to be made up by someone who wanted to cause trouble. Someone knew that house inside and out and had seen something he couldn't keep to himself. The next morning, the sheriff decided to try a different approach. He would go back to the Ashford sisters' property, but this time, Donnelly, a reporter from the local paper. The presence of a reporter might make the twins more cooperative, or at least more careful with what they said. It was a risky move, but Dalton had no other choice. They left one July morning, when the heat was already making the air shake over the dirt roads. It took almost an hour by carriage to get to the property. The path was even narrower than Dalton remembered, with tree branches crossing over it, making it difficult to see. As they got closer, the darkness and stillness got stronger. Even the birds seemed to sing less in that part of the forest. The house appeared as a dark spot in the trees. It was a sturdy two-story building with tall, narrow windows that looked like watchful eyes. The paint was peeling in some places, and vines climbed the sidewalls like exposed veins. There was a heavy silence that filled the whole area. There were no chickens pecking, dogs barking, or any other sounds that would be normal for a rural property. The doorbell rang, and Cordelia answered it before they even knocked. She was wearing a plain gray dress, and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. Her eyes scanned the sheriff, then landed on Peter Donnelly with such intensity that it made the reporter swallow hard. She didn't ask why they were there. She just stood there blocking the entrance. Dalton introduced the reporter and said that they wanted to ask some more questions about Thomas Brennan's disappearance. Cordelia didn't say anything. He told her that they had already said everything they wanted to say on the last visit and had nothing else to say. Her voice was soft and almost melodious, but it had a cold winter sound to it. Just then, Marguerite walked up behind her sister. The two of them looked so much alike, the same height, the same features, and the same emotionless face. Marguerite put her hand on Cordelia's shoulder in a way that seemed both protective and possessive. For the first time, she spoke, and her voice sounded just like her sister's. She asked if they had a warrant because if not, they should leave. Peter Donnelly tried to gain ground by changing his tone. He said he was writing an article about road safety in the area and the dangers travelers faced. He wasn't there to blame anyone, just to find out what might have happened to the salesman. The sisters could help clear up the facts, and maybe even clear their names of the false accusations that had been made against them. For a long time, the twins just looked at each other. During that moment, they spoke without words, but something passed between them. Finally, Cordelia opened the door a little wider and made an inviting but cold gesture. They could come in, but only into the living room. The rest of the house was off limits. It was dark inside and smelled of mildew and something else, something sweet and unpleasant that Peter couldn't put his finger on. The curtains were drawn, letting only the living room's light in. The house had thin strips of light and old, well-kept furniture, but not many personal items. There were no family portraits on the walls or other small decorations. It looked more like a morsel than a home. The sisters sat next to each other like soldiers in training, as Dalton asked basic questions to review what they already knew. Yes, Thomas Brennan had been there and sold some things. No, he hadn't stayed long. No, he hadn't said where he was. Next, the answers went back and forth between the two, as if one person were speaking through two mouths. Peter tried a different approach. He asked about the history of the property and what it was like to live so alone, if they didn't feel scared or lonely. Cordelia smiled for the first time, but it wasn't a warm smile. She said they liked being alone more than being with other people, that city people were noisy and annoying, and that they found peace in the forest. Marguerite added that they had always been like this. Since they were little, they've liked each other more than anyone outside the family. Their father and mother knew this and left them alone. Now that they were alone, they could finally live their lives the way they wanted. That speech made Dalton feel very uneasy. It wasn't the words themselves that were upsetting him, but the way they were said as if the outside world were a threat that needed to be repelled. Peter asked if he could use the bathroom, which is a common reason to look around the house a bit more. The sisters hesitated. Cordelia said that the bathroom upstairs was being renovated, and that there was a bathroom outside in the back if he really needed to. Peter agreed, hoping to get a chance to look around, but Marguerite walked with him to the back door and stood there, watching to make sure he didn't wander off. From the back door, Peter could see the yard. He tried to remember everything so that he could talk about it later. When she went back inside, she saw Sheriff Dalton standing in the hallway staring at a closed door at the back of the house. It was made of heavy dark wood and had a large modern padlock hanging from the handle. The soil looked different in some places, darker and looser, like it had just been dug up and replaced. Some tools, like shovels and hoses, were leaning against the wall of the house, still stuck in the ground. Soon, Cordelia walked up and stood between Dalton and the door like a territorial animal. She told him that was the pantry where they kept food and supplies, and that they kept it locked because of rats. When Dalton asked if he could take a look since he was there, the answer was a firm no. There wasn't anything interesting in a normal pantry, and they were tired of the visitor. It was time for him to leave. There was no way to keep asking without getting into a direct fight. They quickly said goodbye and were led to the front door, where they heard the sound of several locks being set off one after the other. On the way back, the two men talked about what they had seen and agreed that there was something very wrong with that house. The locked door in the back, the disturbed soil in the yard, and the sisters' defensive behavior were all signs of secrets they were fiercely guarding, but they still didn't have any solid proof. Peter decided to write a carefully thought-out article for the newspaper about Thomas Brennan's disappearance and how hard it was to find him. He didn't directly blame the sisters, but he did raise questions. The article caused a stir in the town. Families, who had been quiet before, spoke out. Some defended the Ashfords, saying they were victims of prejudice because they were single, independent women. Others called for a more thorough investigation. The pressure was building. Before the case died down, or the sisters got rid of any evidence that might still be on that creepy property, Eugene Dalton knew he had to act quickly. Peter Donnie's story caused unexpected responses. Over the next few weeks, 3 different people came to the sheriff's office with information they had been keeping for years, hoping that someone would finally pay attention. The first was an elderly woman named Martha Hendress, who lived about 8 kilometers from the Ashford property. She said that on a moonless night in 1899, a few months after the twins' parents died, she heard screams coming from that direction. They were muffled screams, like someone was trying to be heard with their mouth closed. She woke her husband up, but he said it was just coyotes or the wind in the trees. Martha never forgot that sound. The second witness was a middle-aged man named William Garrett, who used to work for the Ashford family as a caretaker on the property from 1896 to 1898. In William's opinion, Jonathan Ashford was a strict and cold boss who treated his daughters badly. They weren't allowed to leave the property without permission. They weren't allowed to have visitors, and they weren't even allowed to talk to the servants beyond what was necessary. Elizabeth, the mother, was like a ghost in the house, always with her head down and quiet. But what really bothered William was the basement. Jonathan never let anyone go down there. He said it was his private space and where he kept important papers and valuables. He kept the door locked with several padlocks. One time, William heard strange sounds coming from down there, like something heavy was being dragged. When he asked Jonathan about it, he fired him right away, paying him only half of what they agreed upon and threatening him with jail time if he told other people bad things about the family. The third witness, Dorothy Sinclair, was a neighbor of the Ashfords when they were young. The twins were quiet and seemed surprisingly mature for their age. At that time, Dorothy lived nearby and sometimes saw the girls playing in the yard. But they weren't playing like other kids. They didn't laugh or run. They just sat next to each other and talked quietly, as if they were always planning secrets. Dorothy also talked about something that had really scared her at the time. She had seen the twins bury babies, birds, squirrels, and other small animals in the yard. When Dorothy told other people about it, they told her it was just childish curiosity, and that many kids do strange things, but Dorothy always felt there was more to it than that. The girls always dug the graves the same size and depth, as if they were practicing. Eugene Dalton put together all of these stories and gave them to Judge Archibald Morrison, who had been the judge of the Buncombe County Court for 15 years. The sheriff said that there was enough circumstantial evidence to warrant a full search of the Ashford sisters' property. The disappearance of Thomas Brennan, the witness statements about suspicious activities, and the anonymous letter about the basement were all signs of the need for a more thorough investigation. Judge Morrison read the papers quietly and adjusted his glasses several times. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he signed the search warrant. But he put some conditions on it. The search should be: everything Dalton agreed to was done properly with neutral witnesses present, and any damage to property should be properly documented and paid for if nothing illegal was found. Dalton finally had the permission he needed, and the operation was set for early Tuesday morning in August. Dalton gathered 4 deputies, Judge Morrison, who insisted on going, and 2 respectable citizens of the city to act as neutral witnesses. Peter Donnelly also wanted to go, but the sheriff said no. This wasn't news. It was police work, and if they found anything, the press would be told at the right time. They left before dawn, hoping to get to the property by daylight. The trip was tense and quiet, and each man was thinking about what they might find. Some hoped it was all a misunderstanding, and that the Ashford sisters were just strange and wronged, while others were afraid they would find proof of their worst suspicions. The house looked even scarier in the morning fog than it did during the day. There was no smoke coming from the chimney and no sign of life. They knocked on the door several times before Cordelia finally answered. She was wearing the same gray dress and her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders like a black curtain. She looked around at the group and then focused on the warrant the sheriff was holding out. She read it slowly and without rushing while Marguerite walked up and gave her a long look. To everyone's surprise, Cordelia just opened the door and let them in, stepped back and waved her hand to let them in. He told them they could look for anything they wanted because they had nothing to hide. But there was a note of defiance or maybe resignation in her voice that made Dalton hesitate for a moment. They went into the house as a group. Judge Morrison stayed in the living room with the sisters while Dalton and the deputies began a methodical inspection of the house. They started upstairs, where the bedrooms were simple, almost monastic, and the beds were made with military precision. They went downstairs and searched the kitchen, dining room, and small office. Everything was too neat and clean, like real life had never been in those rooms. They found some financial documents that showed the sisters lived simply, buying things they needed and nothing extra. There were also old letters from their parents, mostly about their childhood. When they got to the back door that Cordelia had said led to a pantry, it was locked. Dalton asked for the key. There was a pause. Marguerite got up and went to a small sideboard where she found a bunch of old keys. She gave them to the sheriff without saying a word, then sat back down next to her sister and held hands while they watched the key turn in the lock. The sound of the metal clicking echoed through the quiet house. When Dalton pushed the door, it opened with a long, sharp creak. On the other side, there wasn't a pantry. Instead, there was a wooden staircase leading down into the darkness of the basement. One of the deputies brought out a lantern, which showed steps worn down by time, damp stone walls, and cobwebs hanging like macabre curtains. The rising air was cold and heavy, and it smelled like something Peter Donnelly had smelled before, but it was much stronger. It made one's stomach turn and reminded them of bad things. Eugene Dalton was the first to go down, holding the lantern in front of him. The steps squeaked as he walked on them, and the temperature dropped with each step. When he got to the bottom, he raised the lamp and looked around. What he saw chilled his blood. The cellar was bigger than I thought it would be, with stone walls dividing it into different areas. There were shelves on the walls, but they weren't used to store food or supplies. Instead, they held glass jars with dark liquids that were labeled with names and dates. There were also old books, some of which were so worn out that the covers were coming off. Dalton carefully opened one and saw that it was written in a language he didn't understand, with strange pictures and symbols that looked like they belonged to some strange ritual or study. But what really caught his eye was the big wooden table in the middle of the basement. Chains were attached to the walls around it, and there were dark stains on the floor that could be anything, but Dalton knew right away what they were. One of the younger, less experienced deputies went down behind him and saw what was going on. He turned pale and had to run back up, and they could hear him throwing up outside. Judge Morrison came down next, carefully. He stopped when he saw the basement and adjusted his glasses as if that would change what he saw. That's when they heard a sound coming from one of the side sections of the cellar. It was very faint, like a sigh or a muffled groan. Dalton raised his voice. Eugene Dalton carefully pushed open the smaller door, which was almost hidden behind a shelf. It was ajar. The creaking of the rusty hinges sounded like a lament throughout the basement. The lantern revealed an even smaller space, a chamber carved into the ground. The walls were made of rough stone and the floor was packed earth. What made the sheriff stop was what was leaning against the wall. A man of unknown age, dressed in dirty rags, sat with his back against the wall. His hands were tied in front of him with thick ropes, and his ankle was chained to an iron ring on the wall. When light hit him, he raised his face and blinking as if he hadn't seen light in a long time. His hair and beard were long and tangled, and his skin was as pale as wax. Dalton slowly walked up to the man kneeling next to him. As the man tried to speak, his voice came out as a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper. It was clear that he was thirsty and weak. Judge Morrison, who was still standing in the doorway, ordered that water be brought right away. One of the deputies ran upstairs, and Dalton looked at the restraints. They were firm, but not too tight to hurt. There was a bucket in the corner of the room with some leftover food on a metal plate. Whoever that man was, the sisters were keeping him alive by giving him small amounts of food and water. But why and for how long? When the water came, the man eagerly drank it, coughing between sips. Slowly, his voice came back. He said his name was Henry Carver, and that he was a traveling worker who fixed roofs and barns. He had come to the Ashford estate in March of that year to offer his services, and the sisters invited him in and served him tea. After that, he only remembered waking up down here, chained up. Henry didn't know how much time had passed. The days lost their meaning when there was no sun to see them. The sisters came down once a day, always together, with food and water. They never said anything. They just looked at him with those cold, expressionless eyes, checked their chains, and went back up. He tried to scream for help the first few days, but no one heard him because the property was too far away. The sheriff told them to cut the ropes and take off the handcuffs, but Henry could barely stand because he hadn't moved in months. Step by step, deputies helped him up the stairs. When they got to the ground floor, the daylight temporarily blinded him, so he covered his eyes with trembling hands. The Ashford sisters stayed in the room, still holding hands, and watched everything with an unsettling calm. They didn't seem surprised, tried not to run away or offer any explanations. They just stood there like black marble statues. Judge Morrison spoke to them in a calm but firm voice after the initial shock. He asked what this meant and why they were keeping a man locked up in their basement. Cordelia looked at him for a long time before she spoke. Her voice stayed soft, almost gentle, which made what she said even more disturbing. She said they had no choice, that it was necessary, that it had always been necessary. Marguerite picked up where her sister left off, as if they were understanding each other. She said that their father had taught them that it was the only way to keep things in balance and pay back the debt to keep bad things from happening. No one knew what that meant, so Dalton asked, "What debt? How much balance?" What they were chatting about, but the twins stopped talking. They just looked at each other and didn't say anything else. It looked like they both decided at the same time that the conversation was over. The sheriff had no choice but to put them in jail. Both of them were handcuffed, and they didn't fight back. In the same calm way that they did everything else, they were led to the coach. They were next to each other. They were sitting next to each other on the seat, with their hands cuffed together. They didn't say a word the whole way back to Asheville. Harold Carver was taken to see a doctor in town. He was the same doctor who signed the parents of the Ashford sisters' death certificate. The doctor carefully looked at the man. Aside from being hungry and having weak muscles, Henry was fairly healthy. There were no signs of violence and no major injuries. It looked like the sisters had only locked him up and done nothing else. More. But the psychic damage was clear. Henry was scared to close his eyes because he was shaking all the time. At the same time, other officers kept looking into the property. The basement was carefully looked over. The liquids in the bottles on the shelves looked like tinctures or plant extracts, and some of them were obviously deadly. The books were old writings about witchcraft, folk medicine, and other things that the church would consider wrong. There were also journals made by the twins' father, Jonathan Ashford. 1. Eugene Dalton started reading the diaries that very night after one of the officers brought them to him. The first notes were made in 1876, not long after Jonathan moved to the area. When he got to Kentucky, he wrote that he had found something in the woods. He wasn't clear about what it was, but he talked about secrets that are kept in certain places and information that isn't allowed. As part of a deal, he said, he got money in exchange for a promise. Someone promised to feed something not food, but people, being there, with life being held captive. Jonathan wrote that he didn't fully understand how it worked, but that it did. He would keep making money as long as he kept someone locked up in that cellar. Bad things would not happen to his family, and whatever lived in the earth's depths would stay asleep. He brought this habit to North Carolina with him. He made sure that the house had that basement when he built it. He held many people hostage down there over the years, but never for very long, just a few months at most. Then he would put them in faraway places, give them money to start over, and make very bad threats against them if they talked. A lot of them ran west and were never seen again, but people who tried to fight back or who did not make it out of prison were mentioned. Jonathan wrote that they had to be buried in the garden at night and in deep holes every time. He said he felt bad about what he did, but it had to be done. The deal required people to follow it. Any failure would lead to terrible things. The newest ones, from 1897 and 1898, showed. Jonathan became more and more obsessed and upset. He said that he was teaching his girls things that they needed to know and keep doing after he died, because the deal didn't end with him. It was passed down from one family to the next. In every way, Cordelia and Marguerite were his children. The last note was made in January 1898, just a few weeks before he died. Jonathan wrote that he was sick and that he could feel the end coming. He thought that the twins would be able to carry on the practice since Elizabeth wouldn't be strong enough to do so. That's right. They were not the same. Whatever had to be done was what they would do. Eugene Dalton closed the book with hands that were shaking. This was not just an easy crime he had to deal with. This crazy idea had been passed down from father to daughters and had led to decades of criminal behavior. But was it really crazy? Or was there more? He went back to the basement the next morning with some men who dug in the ground and floor where the spots were most obvious. They didn't need to. A long time to find something. Bones. There were shallow pits with human bones in them. Some of the bones were so old that they were almost crumbling when you touched them. They found at least 6 groups of bones, and maybe even more. The news quickly spread through Asheville. People only talked about the Ashford sisters case in the streets, shops, and churches. Reporters came from newspapers in bigger towns. Peter Donnelly wrote every day about things that were hard to understand. For the first time, the twins were held in different cells at the small-town jail inn. Their lives. They didn't eat. They didn't get any rest. They did nothing but sit on their bunks and look at the walls. The guards said that they would whisper to each other sometimes, making it sound like they were talking through the walls that divided them. The hearing was set to happen in October of that year. In North Carolina, it would be the biggest crime case they had ever seen. Asheville was getting more and more tense in the months before the trial. This was the worst thing that had ever happened in the city. Reporters from Richmond showed up, as well as Atlanta and New York. The small hotel was full, so people from the area started letting out rooms to tourists. People got very angry in the bars about the Ashford sisters and what should happen to them. They also talked about whether they were monsters or just had bad parents. Edmund Price, a lawyer from Charlotte, took on the twins' case. He was 50 years old and had worked on many tough cases before. He was known for being able to find legal loopholes and make the judges feel sorry for the accused. When he first went to see his clients in jail, he thought he would find scared or sorry women. Instead, he found Cordelia and Marguerite sitting in their rooms, silent as ever, as if everything were not so important after all. Price tried to talk to them one-on-one, but they both wouldn't talk unless they were with Price. In the end, Sheriff Dalton let them meet together in the visiting room with guards present. There, the lawyer heard the whole story for the first time. The sisters told it in turns, with each finishing the other's words. They talked about how they grew up alone and how strict their father was as a child. For the most part, Jonathan wasn't mean. He never hit them or hurt them, but he constantly shaped their minds by telling them that they were unique and different from other people, and that they had a duty to their ancestors that went beyond human laws. They were taken to the hold when they were very young. They had to watch as Jonathan brought in the prisoners. He said this had to be done in order to keep the natural order of things going so that hungry, old forces don't come up from the earth's depths. He said that those lands had held something since before the colonists came, and even before the original people lived there. This something needed to be appeased. There was no doubt in Cordelia and Marguerite's minds. They were kids, and Jonathan was everything to them. Lizzie, their mother, was too weak to look out for them or question her husband. He had been in charge of her for a long time, that she no longer had any will. It was almost nice when she finally died. The boys were not sad when Jonathan followed them after a few weeks. They were free. However, freedom came with a duty. They really believed what their dad had taught them. They thought something bad would happen if they didn't keep someone in the bottom. They tried to keep doing what Jonathan had done for the first few years after he died. They caught tourists on their own and held them for a few months and then let them go somewhere far away. But something changed. Maybe it was that the neighbors were becoming more suspicious. It could have been the fear of being found out. They began to hold the prisoners for longer amounts of time. Brennan was not the first person to do this. Before him, other people stayed in the basement and waited for their deaths. When that happened, the sisters buried their bodies in the yard just like their dad had told them to do. They always did it quietly and asked for forgiveness, but they thought it was the right thing to do. Edgar Price listened to all of this with a mix of fear and interest. He asked them if they knew it was wrong and that they might have harmed or killed innocent people by taking away their rights. The twins looked at him with those dark eyes that didn't show anything. Cordelia replied that they knew what the law said, but there were also older, more important rules that people had forgotten about but were still in effect. The lawyer saw that he had a case of crazy on his hands. Nobody in the court would believe that story of old. Mysterious forces and deals. However, he might be able to persuade them that the sisters weren't fully guilty for what they did because their father had abused them so much as children. As well as being thieves, they were also victims. The prosecution, on the other hand, was working hard to prepare its case. A man named Samuel Hutchkins was the public lawyer. He was organized. He wasn't interested in stories about people going crazy or being manipulated mentally. The ground was solid. There was proof that the Ashford sisters had done terrible things, like holding people hostage and burying bodies on their land. It was clear from the law what should happen. Henry Carver, the man who was found in the basement and saved, became the main witness. He was slowly getting better, putting on weight and getting stronger, but the mental scars would never go away. He woke up screaming every night from bad dreams. He couldn't stay in places that were dark or closed off. The doctor who was treating him said it was likely that he would never fully get better. Other people also came forward. There were people who had met the sisters briefly over the years and now knew how close they had been to danger. A blacksmith noted that Cordelia had given him a strange look when he fixed a lock on the house in 1901. Someone who works as a seamstress remembered bringing dresses there and feeling like the house itself breathed fear. It was cold on Monday, October 1st, when the trial began. There had never been so many people in the Buncombe County Courthouse. They got there hours early, in order to reserve spots in the galleries. A lot of people gathered outside to wait for word. Some people carried signs that said "Justice." Some people, surprisingly, supported the sisters by saying they were victims of a cruel father. Everyone in the courtroom went silent when Cordelia and Marguerite were brought in. Their hair was pulled back, and they wore simple dark dresses. They walked next to each other, and their steps were perfectly timed. They sat in the dock and didn't look at the people watching. Instead, they kept their eyes on the road ahead. Judge Morrison, the same judge. who gave permission for the search, was in charge of the case. He set clear rules for how things should be done. Any trouble would be met with quick expulsion as a punishment. It was a court of law, not a show for everyone to see. The defense was the first to make their case. There was no hiding what Samuel Hutchkins said. He showed pictures of the house, the basement, and the chains. Henry Carver was called to the stand as a witness. The man was still skinny and pale, and he was shaking as he talked about the months he was locked up in the dark. He didn't know if he would ever see the sun again. Hutchkins also read parts of Jonathan Ashford's notes out loud. The courtroom was dead silent as the words of a dead man exposed crimes that had been kept secret for decades. The prosecutor said that the sisters, who were now grown women, had decided to keep doing what their father did. It wasn't true that they were kids. They were bad people who needed to answer for what they did. In his argument, Edmund Price used a different method. That's not what he said. Not able to. The facts could not be argued with. Instead, he looked at how the charged person thought and felt. He called experts who spoke about the effects of being manipulated for a long time since youth. He talked about how someone who grew up alone and was told that certain views were absolute truths might lose the ability to tell right from wrong. Price said Cordelia and Marguerite never had a chance to grow up with a normal sense of right and wrong. They were like machines that their father had programmed to do a certain purpose. It was against the rules for them to really understand what they were doing. They needed medical care, not to be punished. The defense was smart, but it had to deal with a big problem. The jury was made up of 12 honest, family-oriented guys from the area. They didn't care as much about the psychological details as they did about the brutal fact that people had died and been hurt on that land. When the twins were called to witness, it was the most exciting part of the trial. Edmund Price had trained them and gone over what they were going to say, but it was clear that Cordelia would go her own way when she took the stand as a witness. Her voice was cool and clear. She agreed with everything the prosecutor had said. People were kept in the basement, yes. Some did die. Yes, the bodies were hidden in the backyard. She didn't show any regret or feeling when she said these things. She just told the truth. Cordelia looked right at him when Hutchkins asked them why they did what they did. She said it was. They had to follow through on the deal because if they didn't, worse things would happen. When Hutchkins asked, what could be worse? Cordelia told him that he didn't want to know, that no one wanted to know, and that it would be better for everyone if some doors stayed closed. Some people got chills when she answered, not because it made sense, but because she was sure of what she was saying. It wasn't a lie or an act. It was a strong belief that wouldn't change. "Hi, Marguerite." Then went on the stand and said almost exactly the same things her sister did. It sounded like two people talking at the same time, but in slightly different ways. It had a very troubling effect. 2 weeks passed during the trial. In the end, the judges went away to think things over. It took the jury 4 full days to decide. Those days in Asheville were unbearably tense. On street corners, groups of people gathered to guess what the decision would be. A full conviction was a bet by some. Some people thought the defense had done enough. There were signs that the sister might not be crazy. Peter Donnelly put out special versions of the newspaper every day, which kept everyone up to date on everything. The 12 jurors were in a real tough spot in the discussion room. There was strong proof of the crimes, but figuring out who was mentally responsible was trickier than they thought. There was no psychology or philosophy in them. They were sensible men trying to make a choice about something that went against what they thought people were like. Some. The jurors said that being insane was not an excuse for such terrible acts. Others said that people who were raised like Cordelia and Marguerite couldn't be judged the same way as people who had a normal upbringing and schooling. The debate went on for hours, getting heated at times, But it always came back to the same main point. Did the sisters Ashford know they were going against the rules? On the fourth day, they finally agreed on something. Everyone had to come back when the court bell rang. The room was full in no time. The judge got up and sat down. The sisters were brought in and sat down together, touching hands in a quiet way. A respected businessman named Arthur Patterson spoke for the judges. He stood up. As he read the judgment, his voice shook a little. All of them are guilty. Murder, kidnapping, and fake imprisonment. The room went crazy with different responses. Some cheered, while others sobbed. Many people just stood there thinking about how heavy that moment was. Cordelia and Marguerite did not say anything. They didn't act scared or surprised. They stayed where they were and looked ahead with the same neutral face they had been using the whole time. It seemed like the decision didn't matter to them, like it couldn't be judged by humans. The judge put off the sentence until the following week, but everyone knew what it would be. North Carolina had clear rules about these kinds of crimes. There was only one sentence that could be given for killing multiple people on purpose. Eugene Dalton went to see the sisters in jail the night after the decision. It wasn't his work. There was no reason for him to be there, but he felt compelled to try to figure out who these people were one last time. He found them in different rooms, each one lying on her bunk and gazing up at the ceiling. In the hall between the two rooms, Dalton pulled up a chair and sat down. He asked them if they felt bad about what they did or wanted to explain it better. She turned her head to look at him. She asked him if he really wanted to know the truth or if he was just faking a confession to feel better. The policeman. He told them he wanted the truth. After that, Cordelia told something she hadn't said at the hearing. She said that their dad would take them to the basement on certain nights when they were little. Always when the moon was new and there was the most quiet. All of the lights would be turned off, and they would just stand there and listen. Outside the base of the house, something moved deep inside. It wasn't the wind or rats. It was a bigger thing that breathed with a slow beat from long ago. Jonathan said it had been there before the mountains looked the way they do now, before people had memories, and it needed to be kept quiet. From her cell, Marguerite kept telling the story. She said they thought about giving up when her dad died and they were by themselves. They really tried. They left the basement empty for a few weeks. After that, the dreams started. Dreams in which they woke up on the ground, in the middle of nowhere, feeling something. Huge coming. They woke up screaming and drenched in cold sweat. The dreams got worse every night that the cellar stayed empty. They gave in to fear. Someone was caught and locked up in the basement, where the dreams stopped. This became a pattern for them. Help for prisoners, freedom, dreams, and a new prisoner. It wasn't mean just for the sake of being mean. It was fear. Fear of something they couldn't talk about because no one would believe them. All of this was heard by Dalton, asked a question that was clear. Why did some people die if the only goal was to keep someone locked up? Why not just let them go at the right time? Cordelia dropped her eyes for the first time and said that they did something wrong sometimes. They didn't always know how long the person could hold out, and by the time they did, it was too late. It was a cold admission of carelessness that led to death. Things didn't get better. It could have made them worse. That night, Dalton got out of jail feeling more upset than before. In that story, there was no way out, no moment of clarity when everything made sense. Just two women stuck in a crazy idea that made them okay with committing horrible crimes. The sentence came the next Monday. Judge Morrison was short and to the point. His decision was that Cordelia and Marguerite Ashford should be hanged in 30 days. The 15th of November, 1903 was chosen as the date. The sisters heard the sentence but didn't seem to respond. They were taken back to their cells. They were going to stay until the day they agreed to. The last few weeks have been weird. Asheville became a city in a state of sad waiting. For some, the killing was the only way to get justice. Some people didn't like the idea of hanging 2 women, even if they had done very bad things. Reverend Pritchard tried to offer spiritual comfort to the sisters several times, but they would not listen to any talk of forgiveness or turning away from their sins. Edmund Price tried to get help from the law by going to higher courts and claiming again that the man was insane, but the calls were. Each one was turned down. The law was no longer valid. The judgment was set in stone. Something strange happened on the night before the hanging. Peter Donnelly was able to get the sisters one last interview, which was the first time the press had talked to them directly since they were found guilty. He could spend an hour with each of them on their own. He came with a notebook and pen so that he could write down their last words. Cordelia was more honest than ever about her life. She called the house in the middle of nowhere A. They were in jail, but they loved it because it was all they knew. She talked about her mother Elizabeth as if she were a ghost, who watched over them and gave them sad looks when they were about to do something wrong. And she talked about how her dad really thought he was keeping the world safe from something bad. What did Marguerite say? She talked about her twin sister. Because she had always had Cordelia, she said she had never felt alone in her whole life. They were more than just sisters, she said. They were 2 parts of the same thing, being, and that the only thing that scared her about death wasn't the end itself, but the thought of being split up again after it. They were asked if they had anything they wanted the world to know before they died. Cordelia gave it some thought. He then told them to be more careful about what they hide and that secrets should sometimes stay hidden for a reason. He also said that not all discoveries should be made public. It was a vague and not a good statement. John Donnelly didn't know what to do with it. He put the interview in the morning version of the newspaper on the day of the execution, which led to one last round of speculation and debate. Some saw it as an admission of more crimes that hadn't been found yet, while others saw it as the last straw for mentally ill people. The 15th of November began with gray clouds and the chance of rain. A huge crowd of people gathered around the courtroom, where the gallows were set up in the inner courtyard. At that time, public executions were still popular. At the time, they were seen as important to show justice. However, there was something very disturbing about this one. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the girls were brought in. For the first time in public, they wore simple white cotton skirts and let their hair down. As they walked together to the gallows, they kept their cool all the way. They didn't cry, they didn't shake, they didn't beg for kindness. They went up the wooden steps together. The killer gave them blindfolds to cover their eyes. Both said no. They wished to see. What did Cordelia say in a low voice that only Marguerite and the executioner could hear? She looked at the crowd. No one ever knew for sure what it was, but the person doing the killing was clearly upset. The bows were put down. Reverend Pritchard said one last prayer, but they didn't listen. Instead, they smiled and looked at each other. They had the first real smile anyone had ever seen on them. It was like they were hiding something from everyone else. At 7:13 a.m., the trapdoor opened. It was quick. The doctor who was there said that both of them had died within minutes. The bodies were hung from the trees for the legal amount of time, and then they were lowered and made ready to be buried. There wasn't a public funeral. There wasn't a church event. In the county graveyard, the Ashford sisters were buried in separate graves, which was the law. However, many people thought it was cruel to separate them even after they died. But the twins' deaths did not end the story. In fact, it was just the start of something bigger. Stranger. There were days after the execution when Eugene Dalton ordered a full inspection of the Ashford site. Teams of workers were sent to dig up the whole yard to find more proof of crimes that were being kept secret. They found 3 more sets of hidden bodies in places that had not been looked into before. Each find proved what people already thought. This was something the sisters had done for years, maybe ever since they were left alone after their parents died. The house itself turned into something, with a strange interest. A lot of people came because they wanted to get a better look at the place where so many terrible things had happened. People were breaking in, so the sheriff had to put up guards. Still, some brave souls tried to get in at night, looking for mementos, or just the thrill of being in a place with such a dark past. It was during one of these nighttime patrols that something strange took place. A young congressman named Marcus Webb was walking around the land as a guard when he heard noises coming from inside the house. Their steps were slow and steady, like 2 people walking side by side through the empty halls. Marcus called for more help, and they all came in with their guns drawn. They didn't find anyone. The house was empty and locked from the inside and outside. Even though nothing had been touched, the sound of footsteps kept going for a while before it stopped. The guys, who were pale and tense, left. Marcus swore he would never go back there again, no matter how much they paid. Reports came in of other strange events. Neighbors who lived far away said they saw lights in the windows of the house at night, like someone carrying candles through the dark rooms. Hunters who went by the land said they felt like they were being watched over by eyes that they couldn't see. Some people said they heard whispers from the ground, like sounds that were buried were trying to get to the surface. Peter Donnelly, who was always looking for the next story, chose to spend the whole night at the house to make sure what the reports were true. He brought along. There was another reporter and some flashlights. They went into the living room and made up their minds to write down any strange events that happened. It was quiet for the first few hours. However, after midnight, the temperature dropped a lot, even though it was a warm November night. After that, they heard what Marcus Webb had said. It was easy to hear footsteps coming from upstairs. There were 2 sets of footsteps that were perfectly timed. Peter climbed the stairs with a shaking flashlight in his hand because his heart was racing. There was no one in the rooms, but in. The twins had shared one of the beds, which had 2 pillows pushed together. The mattresses had fresh marks on them, like someone had just gotten out of them. There wasn't any settled dust, and there were new depressions. He touched one and felt it get hot. It's real, but impossible. His friend and he ran out of the house and didn't stop until they got back to town. After that, Peter wrote a piece that caused a lot of debate. Half of the people who read it thought he was lying to get people to buy newspapers. The other half believed him and stay away from that part of the mountains at all costs. Being as sensible as ever, Judge Morrison decided that tearing down the house was the best thing to do. It was best to get rid of it totally if it was making so much noise and fear. In December, a group of workers was hired to start tearing down the building, but they ran into problems they didn't expect. The tools broke more often than usual. Wood that should have been easy to break held strong like it was stone. The workers said they were always in pain, had headaches, and sickness. 2 of them quit the job without giving a reason and left their tools behind. The manager, who was very experienced and had taken down dozens of buildings before, said he had never seen a house that seemed impossible to destroy. They finally chose to set it on fire. It was more useful. In the afternoon of January 1904, they set the building on fire. The fire quickly burned down the house, erasing decades of history. People who watched from a safe distance said they saw something. Interesting. As the fire got worse, some people said they saw 2 shadows standing next to each other in the windows of the 2nd floor. As soon as the fires got that high, the figures were gone. Because the basement is made of stone, some of it survived the fire. Eugene Dalton told them to fill it with dirt and rocks to seal it for good. Workers dumped whole cartloads of debris until there was no more room for them to go. Then they tried to return the land to nature by planting trees there. But the stories kept going on. Over. People kept having strange events in that area over the next few months. A farmer who bought some land with the plan of farming it found that nothing grew there. Even though the seeds sprouted, the plants died before they could make anything. He gave up on the land in the end. This family had planned to build a new house on the land, but they changed their minds after the wife had repeated dreams about two dark-haired women watching her from a distance. The women were always together and quiet. The dreams were so scary that they flatly refused to go back there. 3 years after the events, in 1907, a researcher from Boston who studies strange things came to Asheville to look into it. His name was Theodore Blackwell, and he had written about a number of supposedly haunted places on the East Coast. Theodore spent weeks talking to witnesses, going over records, and going to the spot where the house used to be. His research was printed in a small magazine that only dealt with strange things. He said that it doesn't matter if we believe in ghosts or not. No matter what the manifestations were, it was clear that something had changed the group psychology of that area. Through their deeds and beliefs, the Ashford sisters left a mark on the community's mind that wouldn't go away, even after they were gone. Theodore also looked through Jonathan Ashford's diaries more closely than the cops did. He found references to even older works that talked about practices that went back to the first people who came to live in the Appalachians, and even to the native people who lived there before them. He said that there was a history of cursed or marked places where the land needed certain gifts to stay peaceful. People, of course, didn't believe these ideas because they thought they were silly and made up. But Theodore Blackwell wasn't trying to show that supernatural things happen. His research showed that ideas that are passed down from generation to generation can have as much power over people's actions as any physical truth. What happened to that land over the next few years only made his point stronger. The land was left empty. It didn't sell for any price, no matter how low it was. People stopped going there, and it became an empty spot on the map of the area. The trees that were planted on top of the old cellar grew, but their branches bent at strange angles, as if they were trying to get away from something that was hidden below. Eugene Dalton, who was sheriff for another 10 years, never talked about the case in public again after the hearing was over. But people who knew him well saw changes. He thought about himself more and more, cautious. He told the young deputies to be quiet when they made jokes about the evil house or the ghost twins. He told us that some things were better not assumed, even if we didn't know what they meant. Peter Donnelly finally moved from Asheville to a bigger city and got a job at a more well-known newspaper there. But he kept all of his notebooks about the Ashford case and kept them in a locked box in his office. He told his son years later that they were just mementos from a time when he was younger. I learned that some stories are too important to be told in a light way. Henry Carver, the man who was found in the basement and saved, never fully recovered. He tried to start over, but the months of being alone had left deep scars on him. In search of a fresh start, he left the mountains of North Carolina and went to Tennessee. But he had bad dreams and was always afraid of being in small places. He was only 42 years old when he died in 1911. People who knew him said he looked decades older in just a few years, like the time he spent in the basement made him age faster. Toll even after he was freed. The story of Ashford Estate became part of local legends as a warning. Mothers told their kids this story to scare them into being good. For teens and young adults, it became a dare to go near the place at night, but not many actually did. As the years went by, the story grew, adding more details and exaggerations that made it harder to find the truth. But for those who were there, who saw the trial, who saw the Ashford sisters walk free, to the gallows with that unnerving stillness, they could still remember the story very clearly. They didn't need ghosts or wild claims. The truth was already very scary. The Ashford sisters case has grown into something bigger than it really was over the years. In 1920, a writer looking for attention wrote a book about the case that added things that didn't happen, made up conversations, and said the twins had supernatural skills that no witness ever mentioned. People outside of North America bought a lot of copies. Carolina, where people didn't know the real story and liked the scary and idealized version better. People who had lived through the events were very angry about this. The old Reverend Pritchard sent a letter to the editor complaining about the mistakes. He kept people aware that there were real men and women who suffered and died behind the story. People who lost loved ones never found out what happened to them until their bodies were found in that cursed yard. In 1925, the land where the Ashford property stood was later turned into a state forest reserve. The choice was not symbolic. It was realistic. The state took that land because no one wanted it. There were signs put up to show walkers the way, but none of them said what had happened there decades before. That past seemed to be being tried to be erased from the area's geography. But nature remembers things on its own. In the years that forest guards worked in the area, they always said that part of the forest was not the same. Animals that were less noisy avoided the area where the house used to be. The Nile trees that grew on top of the old basement were not used by birds as nests. Deer went around and around, but never went through. The wildlife seemed to know that there was something wrong with that area of land. An anthropology student at the University of North Carolina wrote his thesis on the Ashford case in 1935. He looked at the story from an academic point of view, looking at how folk ideas and being alone can affect people, can make ways of thinking that have nothing to do with shared reality. He talked to older survivors from that time and put together a more fair story than had been done before. What he found was very interesting. There were other people in the Appalachian area who had strange ideas about the land besides the Ashford sisters. In remote villages, there was a long history of keeping track of marked places, debts that needed to be paid, and deals with outside forces that happened before Europeans came. Colonists. Jonathan Ashford had just gone way too far with these views, which was wrong and illegal. The student said that even though the crimes were real and unacceptable, we needed to look at more than just individual bad behavior to understand them. It was important to look at how cultures that are cut off from each other come up with their own logics and truths, which may seem crazy to people who don't live in those cultures but make perfect sense to people who grow up in them. The thesis was never read by many people outside of academia. It was probably the fairest and most caring look at the case that has ever been done. The sisters were not found not guilty, but it made them more human in a way that the court in 1903 did not. The Ashford case was one of those stories that soldiers told each other in the ditches during World War II, when a lot of young men from Asheville went to fight. A story from home that has become almost magical because of time and distance. Both of them turned into witches. It was like going to a different world through the basement, the building. Became a place where old people put curses on it. With each new narrator, more details were added, and the real story got lost under more and more fiction. As horror movies and TV shows became more famous in the 1950s and 1960s, writers and filmmakers looked into the Ashford case again. A lot of different versions were suggested, and some were even made into sensationalist films. Asheville, which was trying to become a tourist spot again, didn't know what to do with all the attention. Part of the population wants to make money off of the story. Part of me wanted to forget about it altogether. The last person who lived through the events of 1903 died in 1973. He looked like the son of one of the cops who had helped search the house. With his death, the last live link to those times was gone. The story is now considered history. not something that people in the neighborhood remember. Even now, the land where the house used to be is still part of the forest area. Trails go by it, but not right on top of it. Sometimes hikers get lost and end up in that open space where the trees have weird shapes. A lot of them don't know where they are. Some people feel uncomfortable and like they shouldn't be there, so they quickly leave. Not many people know the whole story of what that land holds. The Buncombe County Courthouse is where the official records for the Ashford case are kept. Pages that are yellowed from age, faded photos, and statements written in old handwriting make them up. Researchers sometimes talk to them, but their attention isn't consistent. The story is no longer well known, mostly to people who are interested in past criminal cases or who study the Appalachian region. But a disturbing truth comes to light for people who dig deep into these archives, read the original testimonies, and look at the written proof. There's no easy way to explain it. There is no aha time when everything makes sense. Only the complicated and unsettling truth that people can do very disturbing things when they are raised alone, fed false beliefs, and not exposed to any other kinds of people. Points of view. Cordelia and Marguerite Ashford did bad things. That can't be denied. They took lives, tortured and abused people, and held them prisoners. But they were also hurt. Children whose minds were shaped by a father who took away any chance for them to develop their own morals and used them to carry out his own sick desires. After more than 100 years, the question that still needs to be answered is not whether they were guilty. They were. What do we do with these kinds of stories? How do we remember, without making it too shocking? How can we understand without adding on? So, how do we learn without turning real disasters into cheap fun? It's important to remember that the scariest monsters aren't always magical. They are people. They are caused by dysfunction, isolation, and harmful ideas that are passed down from parent to child like poisonous genes. It serves as a reminder that evil is rarely easy, and that every horrible crime is caused by a web of complicated events that are hard to judge. And, maybe most importantly, it makes us think about how some lies have weight. This means that some stories should not be forgotten, not because they are scary, but because they are true and teach us about how weak people can be. About what happens when we let loneliness and lack of knowledge make their own realities for us. That past is still in the ground in the Appalachians. Over what used to be the basement, trees have grown. Still, the wind blows through the torn. Every once in a while, someone walks into that clearing and feels the weight of decades of pain buried in the ground beneath their feet, but they don't know why. If you've read this far, thank you for sticking with me until the end. This is one of the most upsetting stories in Appalachian history. It's hard to tell and hear these stories, but they are important to remember. If you liked this video, you might want to subscribe to the channel to see more like it. Give it a like if. Let me know what you think about cases like this, and if you found the account useful. Your thoughts are always helpful. Until the next time.